Welcome back to Grade 8 History, Unit Number 1, Creating Canada, 1850 to 1890. This is Lesson Number 2. How did a French majority affect Canada East? And how is Canada West changing? Now, in tomorrow's class, we're going to start off with reviewing some things that we learned about Canada East and Canada West in last year's history class. So what I'd like you to do at home is put this video on pause when I'm done speaking so that you can jot down as much as you can remember about what you learned about Canada East and Canada West last year. Please put the video on pause now. And I look forward to seeing just how much you remember about Canada East and Canada West based on last year's program. But for now, let's proceed. Part 1, we will focus on Canada East. In the 1800s, a majority of the population of Canada East was made up of French speakers called Canadiens. The Canadiens were the descendants of the early French settlers of New France. Most were Catholic and were from the working class. Despite being in the majority, the Canadiens were not wealthy. English businessmen dominated the economies of Montreal and Quebec City, and they did not share their prosperity with the Canadiens. The few Canadiens who were wealthy were those who owned and rented land to working-class Canadiens. These landowners were the seigneurs. When the parent in a farming family died, their land was divided among their children. As time passed, the plots of land became smaller and smaller. This forced Canadian farmers to find additional ways to make money for their families. Often, the men found work in the lumber industry. Business owners realized that these men were desperate for jobs and paid them very low wages. Soon, Canadian families had to borrow money to feed themselves. Many were never able to pay back their debts. I just want to draw your attention to this painting here. I'm pretty sure I talked about Cornelius Krieghoff in last year's history class. Cornelius Krieghoff was a European painter who actually spent a period of time living in Lower Canada / Canada East. And during his time there, he was just fascinated by the lifestyle led by the Canadian people. And he painted many images like the one you see here, just very candid paintings showing people going about their everyday lives. Now, the Canadiens were quite annoyed with Krieghoff because in a number of his paintings, he showed them having certain bad runs of bad luck where their carriage would be capsized, their goods would be strewn about outside after some accident. And so the Canadiens were quite happy when he finally packed up his art materials and left. But if you go to the Art Gallery of Ontario, there is a whole section on Cornelius Krieghoff within the Greater Canadian division of the Art Gallery. It's just something really neat to check out. Since many Canadiens could not earn enough money to pay back their debts, they were forced to give up their farms and seek employment in the cities. In 1800, only 5% of the population of Canada East lived in cities. By 1867, 20% of the population lived in cities. Many Canadiens also moved to the US to find work. And if you have never been to Quebec City, I can tell you it's fascinating, and that is retained so much of its old architecture. You just walk down the streets of Quebec City, and it feels like you've been sent back a good 150 to 200 years in time. When the Act of Union in 1840 joined Upper and Lower Canada into the United Province of Canada, the new colony's government was dominated by English-speaking politicians. This was in an effort to assimilate the French people. This meant that the British wanted the French to change so that they gave up their language and religion and adopted the English culture. And as we learned in grade 7, Lord Durham recommended assimilating the French culture in his report on how to quote unquote fix the political system in the Canadas. Many Canadiens fought back against this attempt to destroy their French heritage. French nationalism was an effort by Canadian leaders to create a national identity that was based on French culture. Several groups of Canadiens promoted Canadian nationalism. The Seigneurs were very critical of the British government when it abolished the seigneurial system in 1854. Catholic bishops and priests traveled to cities and rural areas. They gained political influence and encouraged young Canadiens to become leaders of Catholicism in North America. Church leaders also invested the church's wealth in new industries such as railways, mining, and lumber. And looking at this image to the left, the Catholic Church used the income it made from its investments to build Laval University, thus creating another way to promote education in the French culture. And even today, Laval University is one of Canada's top universities. In the mid-1800s, there was a growing French-speaking middle class that embraced Canadian literature and arts. Writers and artists created stories about Canadian heroes that reminded the Canadiens that they had a proud history and culture long before the British conquered New France. And here's a neat artifact, a postage stamp that was issued some time ago. Joseph Montferrand was a legendary Canadian lumberjack and strongman. Why do you think the government put Montferrand on a stamp and just depict him in this pose? How about you put the video on pause for a minute so that you can write down your response to the question I just read. All right, let's continue. Now on to the second half. We're going to look at Canada West. During the 1800s, tens of thousands of British immigrants were arriving every year in Canada West. By the 1850s, Canada West had evolved from a set of scattered, isolated communities into a network of farms, towns, and cities. The introduction of the railway system was one important factor in the growth of Canada West. Before the 1850s, ships transported exports to Europe. This benefited people who lived near ports, rivers, and canals. For farmers who lived farther away from the Great Lakes, it was difficult to get their goods to market. The introduction of the railway changed this. Cities and towns such as Toronto and Brantford became centers of commerce and expanded to include services for rural populations. Farmers could visit blacksmith shops to have their equipment repaired. Farmers could bring their grain to mills to be turned into flour. Woolen mills turned sheep's wool into fabric for the clothing industry. And when I'm done talking, I want you to put the video on pause so that you can get a closer look at this image and write down your response to this question. What examples of wealth and prosperity do you see in this painting? Okay, let's move on. Between the 1840s and the 1850s, the population of Canada West tripled. Among the tens of thousands of newcomers were British immigrants and Black Americans. Irish people came in such high numbers that they quickly became the largest ethnic group in Canada West. The Irish were too poor to buy even the cheapest land, and they found work in railroad construction and local industries. Unfortunately, there were a number of social tensions between the Irish and other people in Canada West, as well as within the Irish population itself. The Irish found themselves competing for jobs with Canadiens and other ethnic groups. As well, there were serious conflicts between Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants. And conflicts between Irish Catholics and Protestants were considered newsworthy and were often the subject of political cartoons such as the ones seen here. The Orange Order was a secret Irish Protestant society that trained its members to defend the Irish Protestant community from Irish Catholics. However, a large number of non-Irish Protestants joined the order, making it not so secret. The Orange Order became strongly influential in politics, policing, and firefighting. Tensions remained between Irish Protestants and Catholics, however, and between 1849 and 1864, there were 9 major riots in Toronto as a result of fighting between the Orange Order and Catholics. Slavery had been abolished in British North America in 1833. However, slavery was still legal in the southern U.S. In 1850, the U.S. passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed slave owners to find and recapture escaped slaves even where slavery was illegal. This led to 30,000 to 40,000 people to flee to British North America via the Underground Railroad. Several black settlements formed in southern Canada West, from Chatham, east of Windsor, to Georgian Bay. Many of these communities established their own churches and schools. A question for you, which means that you're going to put this video on pause when I'm done talking, is, based on what you see in this painting, what conditions and challenges of the journey on the Underground Railroad can you see? All right, let's proceed. The railroad and the demand for agricultural products led to more farming in Canada West. In turn, farming encouraged other industries. Farmers were now borrowing money to buy machinery to make farming easier. Entrepreneurs started businesses which made and sold farming machinery. Canadians could now buy machinery from Canada West instead of from Britain or the US. The railroad made it much easier to transport farming machinery from the cities to the farms. By 1886, the Massey Company's farm machinery factory was the largest factory in Toronto, employing 700 people. By the mid-1800s, some First Nations communities had successfully adopted European farming techniques. However, new immigrants and land developers wanted the last of the fertile land. The government refused to recognize that the First Nations had ownership of the land they farmed on, and one by one, First Nations tribes were swindled or forced into signing away their assigned territories. A few First Nations attempted to buy their land back, but the Canadian government would not allow them to do this. And this, when you see in the picture, her English name was Catherine Sutton. She traveled throughout Canada West, helping local native tribes start farms. She also spoke out against the Canadian government's unfair treatment of First Nations farmers. All right, so to wrap up this extended video, I leave 3 questions for you to write your responses to, and then we'll talk about them in tomorrow's class. First question, what would lead the Canadien to believe that they were a distinct nation from the rest of Canada? 2, how did the Catholic Church contribute to the development of Canadian nationalism? And 3, what significant changes occurred after the construction of the railway? Which groups experienced positive changes and which groups experienced negative changes in Canada West? Now, if you don't feel ready to answer any of these questions, it means you need to go back and review all or certain parts of today's video. But when you feel confident, please put the video on pause so that you can write down your answers to these 3 questions. I look forward to having a rather lively discussion based around all of the questions included here. But until we meet again, this concludes today's video.